Hi, this is Melissa Nilsson with the Santa Clarita Valley Quilt Guild, and I'm going to show you how to trim a finished quilt before binding. This method that I'm going to show you works well if you have a border or some other design element along the bottom edge of your quilt that gives you a straight line to work from. So in this case, this quilt I had cut a 2.5-inch border. A 1/4 inch of it has gotten taken up in the seam allowance, and then this side, as you can see, is a little wavy. So what I'm going to be doing is using my ruler to line up along this seam of the border between the border and the body of the quilt to give me a straight edge. So I'm using my largest cutting mat, which is a 24 by 36, my largest ruler, which is 24 inches long, and a rotary cutter to do this. I have my quilt laid out on my mat, and I have one end floating over the back side of my table and the other side of the quilt floating over that edge of the table. And I have a book at the top of the quilt to help hold it, to keep it from sliding off the table. So what I do is I use my ruler to find the narrowest part of the border. So as you can see, the quilt, sort of wavy on the sides. I tug it and smooth it out as fast as possible. And then I use my ruler to figure out where's the narrowest part of the border, and I take a measurement. So the 2-inch mark on my ruler, I still have a little bit of fabric from the border overhanging the ruler, so I can trim that off. What you don't want is to find a mark on your ruler where you still have some border underneath your ruler, because then you'll have batting out here. And you want to check for that shortest part of border all the way to the end so that you know the right measurement on your ruler to use. So once I've decided that the narrowest part of my border is 2 inches, I then lay my ruler down on my quilt top, and I sort of gently tug the side of the quilt again to smooth it out and to try to get as straight a line as possible on that border seam. And then I go ahead and make a cut. I then move the whole quilt towards me. And I line up my cut edge along one of the vertical lines in my mat. And it doesn't matter which line. I do that so that I can get a visual up here at the top as well to make sure that the quilt hasn't shifted either to the left or to the right. I move my book up to help hold the top of the quilt. I again smooth the quilt. And then I'm pulling it down towards me as far as I can to get as much of the area I'm going to cut in the quilt onto the mat as possible. So I still have a little bit of cut line down here so that I can line it up. But now the whole rest of the top fits onto my cutting mat. So down here, I have my quilt lined up on the 2-inch mark on my mat. So at the top, I'm going to tug my quilt over until I can see that this top edge of the quilt is beyond the 2-inch line at the top of the mat. And then again, I use my ruler, the 2-inch mark on my ruler. I lay it along that fabric line, and I can gently tug to try to line it up as good as I can so that that 2-inch mark is along that seam all the way down. Now there might be places where you have a little bit of a gap, like here at the bottom. See if I can zoom in. So I've got my edge of the ruler here on the 2-inch line. I've got my 2-inch mark right here on this seam, but then I have a little bit of a gap right in here. That's okay, because up above, you get back right on that seam line with your 2-inch line on the ruler. All right, so with it lined up, I'm going to go ahead and make my next cut. Then I move my ruler on up. So I'm again checking the 2-inch mark on the ruler against that seam line on my border, both at the bottom and at the top. And at the very top, I'm lining up on the 2-inch line on my mat. And I make the final cut. And now you have a relatively straight line along the bottom edge of your quilt. So what you'll do is you'll move your quilt 45 degrees on your table. And you're going to line up this bottom edge of the quilt. Get all the way down here. With one of the lines on your mat, because now you have a straight line. So pick a line on your mat and line up the bottom edge with that straight line. Since we were using the 2-inch mark on our mat before, let's pull the quilt over a little bit so that we line up on the 2-inch mark of the mat. And again, you want to check your border for where's the narrowest point of the border. That's where it looks like it dips in the most. And I confirm that it's still 2 inches from the edge of my border to that point. It could be that if you've sewn your border on really wonky, that it dips more in on one side than the other. So you could end up having a shorter border on one side than another of your quilt. If you don't like that, whatever is the narrowest border that you cut, you can go back around the quilt and make that be the size of the border all the way around. So once it's lined up here along your mat line here on the bottom, you move your ruler in place. In my case, my border, I'm still using the 2-inch mark on my ruler. So I go ahead and line up that 2-inch mark along that border seam line. And then I look all the way down the seam and I sort of do little gentle tugs. To get that border lined up. Down here at the bottom, I'm right at the 2-inch mark on my mat, and then I go ahead and make my cut. The long ends of your quilt, you'll have to make multiple pulls of the quilt to do cuts. So I pull it down, I line up this bottom edge that I've just cut along the 2-inch mark on my mat. And again, I've just arbitrarily picked the 2-inch mark. It's where the camera can see it, so that's what I'm using. It doesn't matter which vertical line you pick. And then I'm going to tug and stretch and flatten out the top of my quilt. Get my book up there to hold it down. I'm now using my legs leaning up against the quilt on my table to hold the bottom edge in place where I've got it lined up where I want. I've got my book at the top edge, holding it down up there. I line up my ruler. Up here on the top, it's possible for your quilt to, kind of want to pull this way since the fabric is pulling it off the table. So I'm going to pull back this top up here and look to see that this edge of my border is over the 2-inch line on my mat. By just a little. You don't want too much over. And here's a good example where my border is not exactly perfectly aligned. So at the bottom, it's right on the 2-inch line. At the top, it's pretty much on the 2-inch line, but it's amongst the middle here, it's a little bit pulled away from the 2-inch line. But that's okay, because that's just, you know, the nature of quilting. I can tug a little bit here to straighten it out a bit, but you don't want to tug too much, because if it doesn't want to naturally lay flat at that line, just let it be a little bit wonky. Okay, so I make my cut. I'm going to pull the quilt down towards me again. I'm going to line up this bottom edge again on that 2-inch line on my mat. And I'm using my legs leaning up against the quilt and the table to hold it in place. Moving my book up again to the top. Again, checking this top edge of the border to make sure that it's right at or over the 2-inch line on my mat. Setting my ruler in place. Putting that 2-inch line on my ruler right along that seam on my border. Gently tugging as needed to get that seam as lined up on that 2-inch mark as possible. Okay, and here's a place where on my previous cut I was starting to get a little bit that way on my cut, so this is going to correct that. Convince my camera to sit up. There we go. Okay. And then again, pull the quilt towards me. So now my top edge is fully on the mat. So I'm going to kind of pull and tug that top edge until I can get my ruler lined up. So again, I've got this side here on my 2-inch mark on my mat. At the top, and gently tug and smooth the top of the quilt. I've got this very top corner hanging over the 2-inch line on the mat. But here, I don't know if you can see, I've got a place where the fabric pulls in just a little bit, but it's still within the 2-inch mark on my ruler. So that just means I need to pull the top of the quilt over a little bit more so that that edge is right there at the 2-inch mark on my mat. So this little edge where it dips in is lined up with the 2-inch mark on my mat. So down here, this edge is on the 2-inch line of my mat. At the top, this edge of fabric is lined up with the 2-inch line on the mat. And then I check the ruler. Actually, I'm going to pull it more towards us so that you can see this better. Okay. So now I've got the bottom edge of my ruler lined up along the edge of the fabric. The fabric is along the 2-inch mark on the mat. Up at the top, my 2-inch mark on my ruler is right on that fabric line, and the edge of the ruler is right along the 2-inch mark on the mat. And I can make my final cut on this side. And that gets us 4 pretty evenly straight sides. You just continue rotating the quilt and doing each side until it's all done. I hope you find that helpful. and happy quilting!